You're standing at the gate, boarding pass in hand, watching the line shrink ahead of you. Then an announcement crackles overhead. The flight is oversold. They need 4 volunteers to give up their seats. In exchange, a travel voucher, maybe a hotel room, a later flight tomorrow. Your first thought is probably something like, how does a plane with a fixed number of seats end up with more passengers than seats? It sounds like a scheduling mistake, the kind of thing that shouldn't be possible when every seat is numbered and every ticket is scanned. But it's not a mistake. It's not even rare. It's a deliberate, carefully calculated business decision made using decades of data on nearly every commercial flight you've ever taken, whether you noticed it or not. I want to talk about overbooking today because it's one of those systems that looks irrational or even a little unethical on the surface, a company deliberately selling something it doesn't actually have enough of. And turns out, once you understand the math and the psychology underneath it, to be a surprisingly rational response to a very specific, very human problem. The fact that people don't always show up for things they've already paid for.
Here's where the common reaction gets it a little sideways. When people find out a flight was oversold on purpose, the instinct is usually to feel like they've caught the airline doing something sneaky, selling the same seat twice and hoping to get away with it. That framing makes sense emotionally, but it skips over the actual reason this practice exists in the first place, which has less to do with greed and more to do with a problem that would otherwise cost airlines, and indirectly passengers, enormous amounts of money: empty seats on a plane that's about to take off. Every airline knows, with remarkable statistical precision, that a certain percentage of passengers who book a flight simply won't show up. Business travelers whose meetings get canceled, people who miss a connection, last-minute changes of plans on fully refundable or flexible tickets. This is called the no-show rate, and it's not a mystery or a guess. It's tracked meticulously, route by route, time of day by time of day, season by season, because an airline that gets this number wrong in either direction loses money.
Let's actually walk through the math, because it's more interesting than it sounds, and it explains almost everything else about how this system works. Imagine a flight with 100 seats and historical data showing that on this specific route, at this specific time, about 5% of booked passengers typically don't show up. If the airline sells exactly 100 tickets, it can expect around 95 passengers to actually board. That means 5 seats fly empty, seats that could have generated revenue for someone else, seats whose costs, fuel, crew, maintenance, get spread across fewer paying passengers than the plane was built to carry. Multiply that across thousands of flights a day, and you're talking about a genuinely enormous amount of lost potential revenue. Revenue that, in a competitive industry with historically thin profit margins, airlines can't easily absorb without raising prices for everyone. So the airline does something that sounds almost too simple. It sells a few extra tickets based on the expected no-show rate, betting that the empty seats it would have flown anyway will now get filled by the passengers who show up in place of the ones who don't. In our example, selling around 5 extra tickets, on average, fills the plane almost exactly to capacity. Most of the time, this works out cleanly. The passengers who don't show up create exactly the space needed for the extra tickets sold, and the flight departs full, without anyone at the gate ever noticing anything happened at all. The complication, in the reason you sometimes see chaos at the gate, is that average doesn't mean every single time. Some flights have a lower no-show rate than predicted. More people show up than the airline expected, and suddenly there are more confirmed passengers than seats. That's the moment you hear the announcement asking for volunteers.
Now here's the part that's genuinely fascinating from a psychology and incentive design standpoint. Because airlines don't handle this shortfall by just kicking people off randomly. They run something close to a live auction right there at the gate. And it's a surprisingly elegant piece of behavioral economics in action. The airline starts with an offer, a voucher of a certain value, maybe combined with rebooking on a later flight. If not enough people volunteer, the offer goes up, and up again. Airlines have learned from years of data roughly what it takes to get enough people to voluntarily give up a seat, and they'd almost always rather pay that price than force someone off the flight, called an involuntary denial of boarding, which comes with much higher regulatory costs, legally mandated compensation in many countries, and especially after a few extremely public incidents in recent years, serious reputational risk. This turns out to be a genuinely useful system for a huge number of passengers too, not just the airline. If your schedule is flexible, if you're not in a hurry, if a free flight later this week combined with a travel voucher sounds like a good trade, this is one of the rare moments where an airline is essentially handing out money to the people who value their time the least urgently, while getting the people who value their time most urgently onto the flight as scheduled. It's a real-time matching system, sorting passengers by how flexible they actually are, using price as the mechanism. The same basic principle behind almost every auction that's ever existed.
Here's the turning point, and it's the piece I think reframes the whole topic. Overbooking isn't really a story about an airline trying to get away with something. It's a story about managing risk and uncertainty at enormous scale, using data instead of guesswork, and building a compensation system specifically designed to make the inevitable mismatches, the flights where more people show up than predicted, resolve themselves through voluntary trades rather than forced removals. It's not a perfect system. It occasionally fails in genuinely bad, well-publicized ways, and those failures are worth taking seriously rather than waving away. But the underlying logic isn't a scam. It's a calculated trade-off between two kinds of imperfect outcomes, some empty seats that cost everyone money through higher fares, or a small, carefully managed chance of an overbooked flight resolved through an auction most passengers barely notice. And once you see it that way, it connects to something bigger than air travel specifically. Any business that sells a limited perishable resource, something that can't be saved and sold later once the moment passes, a hotel room for tonight, a seat at a restaurant, a slot at a popular class, faces a version of this exact same problem. Empty inventory that expires unused is pure lost value, and predictable no-show rates create a real, recurring temptation to sell slightly past capacity, betting on the gap between who books and who actually shows up.
So what's actually useful here, next time you're standing at a gate or booking a flight? The most direct thing is understanding that volunteering for an oversold flight is often a genuinely good deal, not a hassle to avoid, if your schedule allows it. Airlines calibrate these offers based on real data about what it takes to get volunteers, which means the compensation is often worth meaningfully more than the inconvenience, especially if you weren't in a hurry to begin with. It's worth knowing, before you're standing at the gate under pressure, what your own flexibility is actually worth to you, so you can make that trade quickly and confidently if the offer comes up, rather than being caught off guard. It's also worth knowing your actual rights if you do get involuntarily bumped, since in many countries, including under U.S. Department of Transportation rules, airlines are legally required to compensate you according to a specific formula based on ticket price and how much the delay adds to your original arrival time. That's not something most travelers know off the top of their head, and it's genuinely useful information to have before you need it, rather than while you're frustrated at a gate counter. And more broadly, this is a good example of a pattern worth carrying into how you evaluate other systems that look suspicious on the surface. Sometimes something that looks like a company cutting corners is actually a company managing a real, unavoidable trade-off, using data most of us never see, in a way that's more rational and occasionally more beneficial to you personally than it first appears.
What stays with me most about this one is how much genuinely careful engineering sits underneath something that most people only ever experience as a mildly annoying gate announcement. There's a real statistical model behind that overbooking decision, a real compensation strategy calibrated from years of data behind that escalating voucher offer, and a real regulatory framework behind what happens if the voluntary system doesn't work. None of that is visible in the 2 minutes you spend standing at the gate weighing whether $400 in a later flight sounds appealing. That's true of a lot of the systems we've walked through in this series. The parts that feel simplest and most routine on the surface are often the ones with the most quiet complexity running underneath them, built by people trying to solve a real problem, not just extract value from an unsuspecting customer. That doesn't mean every system deserves the benefit of the doubt automatically, but it does mean it's worth asking what problem a strange-looking practice might actually be solving before assuming the least charitable explanation is the correct one. Progress beats perfection here too. You don't need to understand the full statistical model behind airline pricing. You just need to know that the next time you hear that announcement at the gate, there's a real system behind it. And depending on your day, it might actually be worth raising your hand. If you never thought you'd find airline logistics this interesting, that's honestly my favorite kind of video to make. I'm Business Decoded, and if you want more of this, the hidden math behind things that look shady but actually aren't, subscribing genuinely helps. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.